It was the day after Thanksgiving in Fort Lauderdale when a 15-year-old boy made a discovery no child should ever have to face. His father, 46-year-old Jason Bloomfield, an avid Miami Dolphins fan, a devoted son, and a hard worker, was dead. What began as a missing persons concern quickly spiraled into a chilling homicide investigation that would uncover deception, betrayal, and a cleanup so calculated it left even veteran detectives shaken. At the center of it all was a woman who wept in front of officers, her voice breaking as she spoke. Neighbors whispered that her grief looked genuine, almost too genuine. But the truth? It was buried beneath layers of deception, layers that would only come to light when investigators began asking the right questions. What unfolded over the following days was a chain of events that no one saw coming. Not the neighbors who waved at him every morning, not the friends who had just spoken to him hours before, and certainly not the family who would never again hear his voice. This wasn't just a case about a death in the home. This was about loyalty twisted into betrayal, and about how someone can stand at the center of a tragedy while quietly holding the match that lit it. Before we get into the chilling details of this case, make sure you hit that subscribe button. This is Crime Scene Exposed, where we bring you real cases that stay with you long after you've heard them. And trust me, you'll want to hear every turn this story takes. Jason Bloomfield was the kind of man whose presence you noticed before he even said a word. At 46 years old, he had deep roots in Fort Lauderdale, the city where he was born, raised, and built a life. Friends described him as the glue of his circle, the one who never forgot a birthday and never let anyone walk away from a barbecue hungry. His loyalty wasn't just talk, he lived it, from the neighbors he'd helped fix a leaky roof for to the cousins who knew they could count on him no matter what. He worked steadily in Burger King, a role that kept him busy but gave him the pride of providing for his family. Colleagues say he was a rare mix of no-nonsense professionalism and easygoing humor, able to diffuse tension with a joke yet still get the job done ahead of schedule. Outside of work, he loved fishing trips along the Intracoastal Waterway, Sunday afternoons watching football, and cooking, especially the kind of slow-grilled meals that had people showing up at his backyard uninvited. Jason's bond with his family was strong. He had a 15-year-old son and a mom that loved him. In the neighborhood, he wasn't just another face. He was the guy who'd lend you his tools, watch your house while you were away, and check in if he saw your lights off for too many nights. And then there was Veanitta Lenon. On the surface, their relationship looked steady. They'd been together for several years, appearing at gatherings side by side, exchanging smiles and small jokes. But beneath that polite public layer, there were quiet tensions, disagreements that friends sensed but rarely heard in detail. Those who knew them closely would later admit there was a subtle distance in recent months, though neither Jason nor Veanitta spoke openly about it. Still, to the outside world, they were a couple building a life together, a man with deep community respect and a partner who seemed devoted to him. That's why, when news broke that Jason had been found dead in his own home, the shock wasn't limited to his family. It hit the entire Fort Lauderdale community like a gut punch. The people who loved him couldn't begin to understand who'd want to harm him, or why. And as details emerged, it became clear that the answer would not be simple. For years, Jason and Veanitta's relationship appeared steady to outsiders, but to those living closest to them, the cracks had been showing long before tragedy struck. Neighbors would later recall hearing raised voices seeping through the thin Florida night air. At first, the arguments seemed like the ordinary flare-ups every couple has, short bursts followed by silence. But over time, the tone shifted. The yelling became sharper, the pauses colder. What unnerved those nearby wasn't just the volume, but the persistence. These weren't occasional disagreements. They were becoming part of the household rhythm. On more than one occasion, law enforcement was called to the residence. Reports later confirmed at least 2 police visits in the year before Jason's death. Each time, the officers left without making an arrest. Whatever was said inside those walls, it never crossed the threshold into an official charge, at least on paper. But those who knew Jason say he wasn't the type to call the police lightly. If he had, something serious must have been brewing. Friends began to notice other changes. Jason, once easygoing and social, was declining invitations more often. At first, it was work, then just feeling tired. But there was an unspoken understanding that the real reason was closer to home. Veanitta's hold over him seemed to be tightening. She grew increasingly possessive, questioning him about his whereabouts, the people he spent time with, even the length of his phone calls. One friend described it as walking on eggshells. Jason still loved her, that much was clear, but love was now laced with a carefulness that hadn't been there before. Finances also became a sore point. Jason was the primary earner, and according to those close to him, there had been disputes over spending. He had plans for his savings, but Veanitta had her own ideas. These disagreements, though often behind closed doors, sometimes bled into their arguments loud enough for others to overhear. Words like "my money" and "you owe me" were remembered by more than one witness. There were also reports, whispered at first, then confirmed by investigators, that Jason had spoken privately about wanting space. He'd confided in a friend that he was considering ending the relationship, but worried about how she might react. He didn't say she had threatened him outright, but his hesitancy to confront her said more than his words did. Then came an incident that, in hindsight, seems chilling. A neighbor recounted seeing Jason sitting in his truck late at night, just idling in the driveway. When asked about it later, he brushed it off as needing a minute to clear my head before going inside. To the neighbor, it felt like he was delaying walking into something he didn't want to face. By the time the final weeks rolled around, those close to Jason could see the tension was no longer just simmering, it was reaching a breaking point. Arguments were happening more often, the silences growing heavier. And while no one could have predicted the exact ending, there was a shared sense that something was building. Jason's friends would later struggle with the same question. Could someone have stepped in? Could one more phone call, one more conversation, have shifted the path that seemed to be narrowing toward disaster? What's certain is that the warning signs were there. In the shouts, the late-night police visits, the quiet withdrawals from friends, and the subtle but unmistakable control Veanitta seemed to exert. Signs that, in the moment, felt like passing troubles between a couple, but in retrospect read like the prelude to something irreversible. Thanksgiving week should have been a time of celebration. Instead, it became the calm before the storm. On November 23, 2024, neighbors in Fort Lauderdale reported hearing 6 sharp gunshots echo through the apartment complex. It was loud enough to rattle nerves, but when nothing else seemed to happen, life in the building appeared to go on. What they didn't know was that Jason Bloomfield had just been shot in his own living room. According to police reports, Lenon didn't stop there. She dragged his body into a small bedroom, shoved a couch to block the doorway, and began cleaning. Detectives later documented the smell of bleach, rags, and a mop, all used in a desperate attempt to erase what had happened. She didn't call 911. She didn't seek help. Instead, she began telling lies. To some neighbors, the shots were from a friend firing nearby. For some, it was so sudden they thought it might have been a heavy object dropped. For others, the sound was unmistakable, the kind of noise that makes your stomach drop and your instincts kick in. A couple living 2 houses down stepped onto their porch, scanning the street. Nothing seemed unusual outside, but something about that sound stuck with them. Moments later, one neighbor walked over, knocking on Jason's door to check in. When the door opened, it wasn't Jason who answered, it was Veanitta Lenon. Her posture was tense, her voice quick and clipped. She told them Jason wasn't home, that he had gone out after a disagreement. But behind her, the bedroom door was shut tight, and she didn't make any move to open it. What the neighbors didn't know then was that she was deliberately blocking that door, keeping anyone from getting a glimpse inside. When more neighbors gathered, concerned about what they'd heard, Veanitta stuck to her story. Her tone was defensive, yet she appeared to be on the verge of tears. At first glance, it looked like grief. But those who stood face to face with her that night later recalled something that didn't sit right. The tears didn't seem real. Her crying came without the flushed skin or trembling voice that normally follow deep distress. It felt like she was performing, not breaking down. The first officers on the scene were met with the same explanation. Jason had left after an argument, she didn't know where he was, and the noise was probably nothing serious. She repeated that he was fine, and might just need some time to cool off. But the officers noticed things she couldn't explain away. Jason's car was still in the driveway. His phone was on the kitchen counter, and her refusal to let them into the bedroom immediately raised a red flag. She claimed the room was messy and not worth looking at. When police insisted, she stalled, positioning herself in front of the door, reaching for explanations that didn't quite match her earlier statements. Family concern grows. Word began to spread through Jason's family that something had happened. Calls to his phone went unanswered. Text messages were never read. For a man who was usually responsive, even in the middle of work, the silence was alarming. Family members began calling each other, trying to piece together what was going on. But all they could confirm was that Veanitta's story didn't make sense, and that Jason hadn't been seen since before the loud noise neighbors had reported. For now, the truth of what was behind that locked bedroom door would remain hidden. But the unease was spreading, and the questions were multiplying. The next day, Jason failed to show up for his shift at Burger King. His manager noticed immediately. Jason was reliable. He didn't just skip work. Still, days passed, and Jason's body remained hidden. The timeline was chilling in its precision. After the shots rang out on November 23rd, Lenon's movements seemed almost rehearsed. She stayed in the apartment, blocking the bedroom door where Jason's body lay. She avoided direct answers when concerned neighbors knocked. Detectives later said she used Jason's own phone to access his bank account, transferring money to herself through Zelle. Her social media presence didn't falter. In December, she even posted, "Satan gets busy, but you gotta know when he's working so you can let God handle up on your behalf." A haunting statement from a woman now suspected of taking a man's life. It wasn't until November 29th, more than 5 days later, that Jason's family decided they couldn't wait any longer. His mother and teenage son went to the apartment. The smell hit them before they reached the bedroom. When they forced their way past the blocked door, they found Jason's body in the advanced stages of decomposition. They called 911 immediately. Police returned to the scene, this time treating it as a homicide. While they were still there, Lenon arrived in her silver BMW. Officers noted her crying, but there were no tears. Her story shifted again, but the evidence was piling up. Phone records, GPS data, the financial transaction from Jason's account, and witness statements from neighbors who heard those 6 gunshots. A 43-page arrest warrant was issued. On May 2nd, 2025, a patrol officer recognized Lenon on the street and took her into custody without incident. In the hours following the arrest, the Fort Lauderdale Police Department issued a brief but firm statement. Based on evidence collected at the scene, statements from witnesses, and the timeline of events, we believe Jason Bloomfield was killed inside his home on the evening of November 23rd. His partner, Veanitta Lenon, has been taken into custody and charged in connection with his death. The first court appearance came just 2 days later. In a quiet, tense courtroom, Veanitta stood before the judge. Her voice was clear but cold as she entered a plea of not guilty. The prosecutor requested she be held without bond, citing the seriousness of the charge and the strength of the evidence. Her defense attorney countered, painting her as a woman who had found herself in an unfortunate situation and denying any involvement. But the judge sided with the prosecution. Veanitta would remain in custody pending trial. The trial of State versus Veanitta Lenon began under intense public interest. Courtroom benches were packed with Jason Bloomfield's friends, family, and curious residents who had followed the case since the day of his arrest. From the very first moments, the prosecution's strategy was clear. They weren't just trying to prove that Veanitta had pulled the trigger. They wanted the jury to see the person they believed she truly was. In opening statements, the lead prosecutor described a relationship poisoned by control and manipulation. They painted Veanitta as a woman consumed by jealousy, quick to anger, and skilled at emotional domination. Jurors heard about previous arguments overheard by neighbors, shouting matches that sometimes ended with Jason leaving the house, only to be lured back hours later. There were accounts of her monitoring his phone calls, questioning his whereabouts, and even confronting him about financial decisions she didn't approve of. Then came the more unsettling details, alleged threats Veanitta had made during heated exchanges. According to one witness, she once warned Jason, "You're not leaving me. Not alive." The prosecution suggested that the killing was not spontaneous. Instead, they argued it was the culmination of escalating control, a fear of abandonment, and possibly financial strain. Evidence was introduced showing that Jason had recently discussed moving out and separating finances. This, prosecutors claimed, threatened the stability and lifestyle Veanitta enjoyed. The most jaw-dropping moments came when friends and neighbors took the stand. One neighbor described the night of November 23rd, hearing a loud bang, then seeing Veanitta moments later through a window, pacing in the living room, and holding her phone without dialing 911. Another friend testified about a conversation just weeks earlier in which Jason confided that he felt trapped and scared to confront her about ending the relationship. But perhaps the most emotional moment came from Jason's mother. Fighting through tears, she recalled finding her son's body. Her voice cracked as she looked directly at Veanitta and said, "You took him from us, and for what? Because you couldn't stand the thought of losing control." Veanitta's defense attorney worked to counter the image painted by the prosecution. They argued there was no direct evidence placing the gun in her hand at the exact moment of the shooting. They suggested alternate scenarios, even floating the possibility that Jason may have harmed himself, though the forensic evidence strongly disagreed. Veanitta herself took the stand, maintaining her composure and denying every accusation. She claimed she loved Jason, and that the night of the shooting was a blur she still couldn't fully explain. Yet, under cross-examination, her demeanor cracked. When pressed about the locked bedroom door and why she lied to neighbors, her responses grew defensive, her tone sharp. By the time closing arguments approached, the jury had heard a story filled with control, fear, and ultimately, fatal consequences. When the jury finally returned after hours of tense deliberation, the courtroom was so silent you could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights. Veanitta sat rigid, her hands clasped together on the defense table, eyes fixed on the floor. The foreperson stood and, in a clear voice, announced the verdict. Guilty of second-degree murder. Gasps erupted from the gallery. Jason's family clutched one another, tears streaming down their faces. His sister closed her eyes, whispering what seemed to be a quiet thank you. The judge, maintaining a measured tone, set the sentencing date and ordered Veanitta into custody immediately. She was let out in handcuffs, no longer the woman in control. Weeks later, the sentence was handed down, 40 years in state prison. The judge emphasized that while the jury had not found premeditation beyond a reasonable doubt, the act was deliberate enough to warrant a severe punishment. In his statement, the judge said, this was not a crime of passion. It was the tragic result of a pattern, one that ended with a man's life taken and a family shattered. For Jason's loved ones, the verdict brought justice, but not closure. His mother spoke to reporters outside the courthouse, her voice trembling but resolute. We'll never get Jason back, but maybe now we can sleep knowing the truth is out, and she can't hurt anyone else. Neighbors, who had watched the relationship unfold with unease, expressed relief. Many admitted they had always feared something like this could happen, they just never thought it would end in murder. The case sparked conversations in Fort Lauderdale about recognizing warning signs of controlling relationships and the importance of intervening before arguments turn deadly. Advocacy groups used Jason's story in outreach programs, urging people to speak up when they sensed danger behind closed doors. In the end, Jason Bloomfield was more than a victim in a headline. He was a son, a brother, a friend, a man whose warmth and generosity touched countless lives. His death serves as a stark reminder that beneath the surface of perfect relationships, darkness can hide. And as for Veanitta Lenon, she will spend decades behind prison walls, living with the reality of what she's done, and the knowledge that control cost her everything. If you were on the jury, what would you have decided? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next case we uncover.